Hello, BISC130. This is the beginning of recorded lecture 5.2. Last time we began this chapter, we talked about population ecology, and we started talking about community ecology, but we, had to cut off about halfway through. We've got more to talk about ecology at the community level. Again, at the community level, we have lots of different species, and they interact with one another. We saw predation last time, and now we're going to look at something called the competitive exclusion principle. Because yes, within a community, when you have different species, they're not just killing and eating each other, they are competing with one another for resources. So the competitive exclusion principle states that, I'm reading from the key terms here, no two species can coexist in a habitat if they compete for the same resources at the same place and time. In other words, if you have two members of the community, two species within the community that are trying to do the exact same thing, eating the same type of food, active at the same time of day, finding shelter in the same sorts of places, if they're trying to play the exact same game, they're not going to be able to coexist. So let's take a look at what this, how this can play out. So this is, kind of a boring example, but it's an easy enough one to watch happen. This is a paramecium, Paramecium aurelia. It's a single-celled organism, and if you start a population of this in a aquarium, basically, over the course of a couple of weeks, you're going to see the normal growth curve we saw last time. Very rapid growth at first, slowing down, carrying capacity. All this is normal. Here's a different species of paramecium, Paramecium caudatum. It's got, a growth curve that looks pretty much the same. And, if you look at the lifestyle of these two different species, they are doing the same thing. They're swimming around, they are eating bacteria, they are using the resources of their environment pretty much exactly the same way. So they do fine on their own, but if you put them together into a community, competitive exclusion says they cannot coexist. One of them is going to be the superior competitor. In this case, it's the Aurelia. And the other one's going to be dead. It's going to be extinct within that community. You see the purple line. Oh, they can coexist for a short amount of time, but as soon as those resources start to get scarce, long term, nope, one wins, the other one loses. So again, this is mostly just defined in the key terms. This was just to show an example of that. But yeah, this leads to the extinction of one species in that community. Importantly, this only happens if these two species are really doing the same thing, going after exactly the same types of foods, having the exact same lifestyle. There can be some overlap. For example, here is a wide array of small songbirds that all live together in certain communities, and they all eat thistle seeds. And these are seeds coming out of these thistle plants. They overlap. They all go after this same food source. But that's not the only thing that they do. There are enough differences between each of these birds in the exact types of trees where they make their shelter, or the times of day that they're active, or the other food sources that they go after. So there is some overlap, but none of these birds are doing the exact same thing as another one of them, so they are able to coexist with one another. So small differences even if they're small, can allow for coexistence. This only kicks in if you're really doing the exact same thing. Okay. Enough for competition. Now let's talk about another relationship that can occur within a community: symbiotic relationships, also known as symbiosis. This one's also in the key terms, defined as the close and impactful interaction between individuals of different species over an extended period of time. So yeah, this is a relationship between different species, but it has to be close. It has to be quote unquote impactful, whatever that means. That is a little fuzzy. And it does have to be over an extended period of time. Importantly, predation is not symbiosis. This is definitely an interaction. It's definitely up close and personal. It's definitely impactful, but this is not the kind of extended relationship that we see in symbiosis. Predation has a lot in common. It's an interaction. It's in the community. Predation is not symbiosis. So what is an impactful long-term relationship? Well, let's look at some examples of symbiosis. And to look at these examples, we're going to look through them and see the three different types of symbiotic relationships, starting with one called mutualism. Mutualism, a type of symbiosis, is defined in the key terms: a type of symbiotic relationship in which both species benefit. So yeah, it's got the word mutual right there in the name. This is a type of long-term interaction that's good for everyone involved. A classic example of mutualism involves pollinators and flowering plants. So yeah, you've got you've got bees, but there are plenty of other pollinators. There are bats and birds that pollinate as well, and of course plants that make flowers. The relationship here is the pollinators are visiting these flowers because there's nectar in the flower. They're getting a free meal. The pollinators absolutely benefit from visiting flowers. The flowering plants benefit from this because as they come in to get nectar, they're going to get some pollen attached to their bodies, their fur, their feathers, whatever, and they're going to deliver that pollen to another flower as they buzz off to get some more food. We talked about pea plants several chapters ago when we were talking about genetics, and yeah, pollen creates sperm. They need this pollen to move around in order to, complete their sexual life cycle. Yes, they can just release it into the wind, but this is a much more targeted approach. The flowering plants benefit from having partners spread their pollen for them. The pollinators benefit. Everyone wins. That's mutualism. And again, this is long term. These pollinators keep doing this year after year after year. The flowering plants keep making flowers year after year after year. This is a long-term interaction, and it impacts both species. Another example over here, the clownfish and the sea anemone. The clownfish gets a nice safe home. There are stinging nematocysts on the sea anemones. We'll talk about nematocysts if you take BISC132 with me. But yeah, the clownfish gets a nice home, and in return, it keeps the area clear of debris, keeps the area safe from things that may try to attack the anemone, and yeah, they both benefit from being near one another, so it's mutualism, and yeah, this is long-term, and this is impactful. So that's mutualism. Another type of symbiotic relationship is parasitism. I think we all kind of know what parasites are, but if you want a formal definition, parasitism is a type of symbiotic relationship in which one species benefits, parentheses, the parasite, while the other species is harmed, parentheses, the host. So yeah, we're probably familiar with parasites like ticks, because yeah, these can parasitize us as well, but here they are attached to a bird. Or, hopefully you're not that familiar with tapeworms, but yep, these are other parasites that can affect humans. This is a pig intestine, I believe, riddled with tapeworms. But no, these are animals that, steal blood or steal resources from the digestive system. Again, it's a long-term interaction, not just killing something and eating it. It's about stealing resources, and again, it's impactful to everyone involved. The parasite benefits free food. The host is harmed, losing blood, losing nutrition. Yeah. These are great examples from an animal perspective, but I do want to point out that we see this outside of animals. There are plenty of plants that are parasites as well. Mistletoe is a parasite. It attaches itself to the vascular system of other plants, of trees, and steals resources from them, not unlike a tick. That's why mistletoe stays green in the winter. It doesn't need to worry about, shedding its leaves and, saving resources. It's stealing its resources in the first place. So yeah, this is an example of a plant parasite. The mistletoe benefits, the tree is absolutely harmed. This can even get a little abstract in what we call brood parasites. So the cowbird, and there are a few others like this, will lay their eggs in another bird's nest. And to us, it's obvious that this baby bird, which is several times the size of the parent, is not actually a baby Wilson's warbler, but oftentimes the bird doesn't know the difference. It's an egg. It was in their nest. It hatched. They're going to feed it. And in the meantime, I don't see any siblings in this nest. Oftentimes, the brood parasite will knock its siblings out of the nest, or at least, because of its size, grab the food brought to the nest more than its siblings. So this is definitely a long-term interaction between these two different species in the community. One benefits. The cowbird gets, free food for its offspring, doesn't have to take care of them at all. And the host is definitely harmed. Its actual offspring are not getting the food that they need. So, they're being harmed by this. So, yeah, this counts as a symbiotic relationship. It counts as parasitism. By the way, I'm not writing down any of these specific examples of things. You don't need to remember these specific examples. You need to know the definitions of, these different types of symbiotic relationships to answer test questions. You just don't have to memorize my specific examples. So, moving along, there are 3 types, so there has to be a third one. This is probably the weirdest, least intuitive one, but I'll walk through this. This is called commensalism. The key terms define commensalism as a type of symbiotic relationship in which one species benefits while the other species neither benefits nor is harmed. In other words, one benefits, the other is neutral. So let's look at some examples of this, because again, this is kind of weird. We looked at plant parasites just a second ago. But there are plenty of other plants that grow on other plants that don't harm them. Spanish moss is an example. There are plenty of other of ferns and lichens. That's a whole nother can of worms. There are plenty of other organisms that will grow on trees but don't steal resources from them. They're just kind of hanging out. So the tree does not benefit from having Spanish moss growing on it, but the tree is also not really harmed by having Spanish moss on it. The tree is pretty neutral in the affair. In contrast, the Spanish moss definitely benefits. It gets closer to the sun, it gets up off the forest floor, so one partner is benefiting, the other one is pretty neutral. We see this in animals with sharks and suckerfish, also known as remora. Again, this looks like a tick, style parasite, but the remora is not chomping away flesh, it's not stealing blood. The remora is just hitching a ride. And this doesn't really harm the shark to have, this extra passenger. It doesn't really slow it down or waste a significant amount of energy having to swim by. But the remora gets a free ride. And when the shark makes a kill, the remora will detach and grab some bits of food, but those are bits of food that are too small for the shark to really care about in the first place. So the shark is not being significantly harmed. It's definitely not being helped. It's pretty neutral. It will try to eat this remora given the slightest chance, but it's not being significantly harmed by the remora. It's not being significantly helped by the remora, but the remora definitely benefits from this. Free access to kill sites, free, trip around the ocean. One partner benefits, the other is pretty neutral. That's our definition of commensalism. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our chapter on populations and community. I couldn't quite get to the end of it in the previous recorded lecture, but we finished that chapter now, and we are going to move on within this recorded lecture to more ecology stuff, going to even bigger picture. So yeah, we went from the population level to the community level. Now we're moving to the ecosystem level as we move on to chapter 46, ecosystems. The key terms define ecosystem as all of the living things in a particular area together with the abiotic or non-living parts of that environment. In other words, this is the community. It's all the different populations of all the different living things, plus the stuff that's not alive. That includes the water, the air, the sunlight, the mineral nutrients, the oxygen in the air, stuff like that. Very important for the living things, but now we're going to talk about those sorts of kind of abstract non-living components. Now, there's some terminology when we talk about ecosystems, just how we label these. So we can label ecosystems into 2 broad categories: terrestrial or aquatic. Terrestrial means on land, aquatic means in the water. Within aquatic ecosystems, we could break this down further into freshwater aquatic ecosystems where the water does not have a significant amount of salt, and then marine aquatic ecosystems. We're talking about the oceans, you're talking about salt water here. So just our terminology. Terrestrial means on land, aquatic means in the water. You got freshwater or you got marine, which means salt water. We can further divide terrestrial ecosystems into places called biomes. So, oh boy, there's a whole bunch of these. So there are lots of different biomes that exist. We are not going to go through all of these. I don't think in intro course you need to know the difference between an arid desert and a dry steppe. What I do want you to get out of this is, how we determine the difference between an arid desert and a dry steppe. The way we define these biomes is based on their average annual temperature, whether they're very cold or very hot, and their rainfall, whether there's a lot of rainfall or very little rainfall. So we're not memorizing all of these biomes. You just need to know this, that these terrestrial ecosystems are further divided into biomes based on temperature and precipitation. I said rainfall earlier, but technically it could be snow, any sort of water coming down, precipitation. That's how we define biomes. All right. With that terminology out of the way, let's start talking about food chains. So members of an ecosystem can be organized into structures, diagrams called food chains. Positions within these chains are called trophic levels. Just more terminology here. So let's take a look at an example food chain, and as we learn the names of these different trophic levels. Again, the idea of things eating other things, I think we're all familiar with, but there's some terminology that comes with this that is important. This is going to be a food chain in Lake Ontario as my example. So this is an aquatic ecosystem. This is a freshwater aquatic ecosystem. Obviously, I've hidden a bunch of stuff because we're starting at the bottom here with a trophic level called primary producer. In this case, it says green algae. So in this food chain, the primary producers are almost always photosynthetic, and primary producers are autotrophs. Now, this may sound like a familiar term to you, and this may look like a familiar figure to you. I brought this up much earlier in the quarter when we were talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Autotrophs, which include plants, but also, lots of different types of algae and some bacteria. Autotroph is defined in the key terms as an organism that gets carbon from inorganic sources. In other words, it's doing photosynthesis and capturing inorganic carbon, CO2, and using that to build organic molecules. So we've got our primary producers, which are eaten by primary consumers. In this case, it looks like some snails that are going to crawl along the rocks in this lake and scrape up some algae growing on those rocks. So these primary producers are eaten by primary consumers, also known as herbivores. This figure just called them primary consumers. These things are also known as herbivores, which we defined in the last chapter. These things are not autotrophs. Herbivores are heterotrophs. And again, this familiar, animals are heterotrophs, fungi, most protists, bacteria. Heterotrophs are, to read from the key terms, an organism that consumes organic substances or other organisms for carbon. Again, the difference between autotroph and heterotroph, this is all about carbon. Where do you get your carbon? Do you fix your carbon from inorganic sources, from the air, or do you get carbon by eating other stuff? So these primary consumers, also known as herbivores, are heterotrophs. Okay. In turn, these primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers. So, you got a fish here that's going to swim along and chomp down these snails. Secondary consumers, they're also heterotrophs, so they're a bit higher on the food chain, but at the end of the day, they are not fixing their own organic molecules. They're eating stuff. These are also heterotrophs. primary or secondary consumers are then in turn eaten by tertiary consumers. Here we have a bigger fish which will eat these smaller fish. And so, yep, now we have tertiary consumers. Again, they're even higher up, but they're still heterotrophs. In turn, these tertiary consumers will be eaten by, well, okay, that's the top of this food chain, but there are other food chains, especially in the ocean, that just go higher and higher and higher. You can have quaternary or 5th level, 6th level, 7th level consumers. I'm not going to label all those. You should know primary producers, primary consumers, also known as herbivores, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and then I'm just writing etc. Until you get to the top consumer or apex consumer, however many levels it takes a consumer that, does not have anything else preying upon it and consuming it. Now, there is one very important part of a food chain that is missing from this figure. And that has to do with the fact that, these mollusks are actively seeking out algae to eat. And, these slimy sculpin are actively, hunting down mollusks to munch or, whatever. But regardless of what level you're on, everything dies eventually. So a very important part of any food chain is decomposers. So, and this is showing arrows of all levels pointing here. So I don't want to say decomposers are at the top, even though they are, quote unquote eating or getting carbon from the top level consumers. They're not really at the top. They're not really at the very bottom either, because they don't start things off by fixing carbon. They really are off to the side with everyone pointing to them. Dead organisms of all levels and their wastes, so everything dies and everything makes waste, are consumed by decomposers. And even though they are eating dead stuff or wastes, they're still not fixing carbon. These decomposers are still heterotrophs. They are still, getting their carbon from organic sources. They're not fixing anything themselves. So decomposers, very important part of this food chain. Not at the top, not at the bottom, really off to the side, but very important. Now, this is obviously a huge simplification of an ecosystem, of a community. This is a massive lake. There's not just one type of algae. There's not one type of herbivore or two types of fish. There are a ton of different species living within pretty much any ecosystem. So the food chain, really simplifies things as level 1, level 2, level 3. A more accurate way to show all the different interactions is through something called a food web, which, this is looking a lot more complicated, but it is showing there are lots of different species at all these different levels. So the food chain can also be diagrammed as a holistic, nonlinear, quote-unquote, food web. Another interesting thing about this kind of food web is, some of these things are eaten by multiple other things. So these snail mollusks are eaten by, if we follow the line here, they're eaten by white perch, they're eaten by white bass, they're eaten by yellow perch and carp and alewife and gizzard shad and, all this fun stuff. Another thing you'll notice is that species can occupy multiple levels. So, for example, here's this crustacean, the Gomeris, which, is eating photosynthetic flagellates. That would make it an herbivore, but it's also preying on some of these other microorganisms, some of these other invertebrates. And so that would make it, if we go back to our food chain, that would make it a secondary consumer. So it's both of these. And we see this a lot in food webs. Species can occupy multiple levels. It's a lot more complicated than just level 1, level 2, level 3. So, just an interesting way to view these things and see more of the complexity of just how complicated all these relationships are within an ecosystem. Now, this was all talking about carbon. I was emphasizing which ones are autotrophs, which ones are heterotrophs, where does the carbon come from, where does the carbon go to, all that stuff. Another thing that we can track throughout an ecosystem is energy. So energy enters virtually all ecosystems. There are some exceptions, but energy enters most ecosystems from the sun and is harnessed by photosynthesis. This familiar diagram. But yeah, the energy to do all of this stuff is coming in from sunlight. So it's not just carbon that's transferred around within food chains and food webs. Energy is transferred from level to level to level in food chains and food webs. So, yep, all these same diagrams, but yeah, pretend that the arrows mean energy instead of carbon. You get the same sort of principle. Now, there's something interesting that happens when we look at energy being transferred from, species to species to species within these food chains and food webs. With each transfer of energy, some of it is quote-unquote lost to heat. Now, I talk about losing energy. Hopefully, you're immediately remembering the first law of thermodynamics. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. So we cannot actually have energy disappear. But when energy is converted to heat, which is a form of energy, we can't really do much with heat. We can't really harness it to, create chemical bonds or things like that. So heat energy in biological systems is not really harnessable the way other forms of energy are, like chemical potential energy. So when stuff gets converted to heat, it's essentially lost to us because we can't do anything useful with it like we can with other forms of energy. So what does this look like? Well, here's a diagram of a food chain. You got algae here, you got herbivores, you've got, the things that eat them, you got the things that eat them, you got the things that eat them. But what these blue bars are indicating is the amount of energy, the amount of calories. So let's say we start with 1,000 calories worth of algae, yum, and those 1,000 calories are eaten by animal plankton, herbivores. Now the bar is much smaller. We're down to 150 calories. Where'd those 850 calories go to? They were quote-unquote lost to heat energy. Now, the animal plankton is eaten by smelt. The smelt is eaten by trout. The trout is eaten by human, although I guess looks like we could eat smelt as well. But yeah, the calories are going to 150, 30, 6, 1.2. You're losing more and more of this energy as you go through this food chain, as that energy is, again, lost to heat. Here's another figure that kind of shows the same thing. Solar energy coming in, primary producers, herbivores. This says primary carnivores. It's just a different terminology. You really only need to worry about, the terminology I used up here. I'm sorry that this diagram is a little bit different, but the things that eat herbivores, the things that eat them, energy is being transferred, but you'll notice, and oh yeah, here's feces and death. Everything pointing over here to decomposers, also known as detritivores, but every single one of these living things is contributing to heat. Every single chemical reaction, this says cellular respiration, but every single chemical reaction that all these living things of all levels are doing is creating some amount of heat energy. So yeah, that's why these numbers get smaller. The energy is lost as it moves to heat with every single transfer through these chains and webs. Now, there is another way to diagram, to sort of look at this energy transfer and other things. We can look at things called ecological pyramids. So this is just another way of looking at energy. So this is Silver Springs, Florida. Looks like this is an aquatic ecosystem. And yeah, this is called a pyramid because if you look at the amount of energy at the base is very wide. But as you go up to the things that eat plants, there is less energy total in the ecosystem. Go to the fishes that eat these insects and snails, there is less total energy. You go to the bigger fishes, the higher level consumers, there is less energy. It gets smaller as it gets closer to the top. And there's decomposers kind of off to the side. But yeah, this more or less looks like a pyramid. So this is emphasizing the following point. At higher levels within an ecosystem, there is less energy. Again, you're losing it as you go higher up. Whether you want to look at it like this or like this, there is less energy as you go higher in the food chain in an ecosystem. that's not the only thing that changes. We can also use these pyramids to look at the number of individuals. So now we're in a grassland for some reason, looking at the amount of total individual grass plants. And yeah, it's a very wide base of this pyramid, but if you start looking at the total number of herbivore insects, it's way less. And if you look at predatory insects, there are way fewer of them and way fewer birds as you go higher up. So going from the base to the top, not only is there less energy, there are also fewer individuals. So at higher levels, less energy, fewer individuals, and of course I got space here for a third, you also have less biomass. So biomass is just the grams per square meter, like the total amount of mass here. If you were to look at the mass of these plants, we're back to Silver Springs, Florida. If you were to look at the mass of all of these plants, you'd have a certain number, but as you go higher up, number gets smaller. As you go higher up, number gets smaller. As you go higher up, number get even smaller. This is also something that dwindles as you get higher up, which, again, makes sense. For these big fish to survive, they don't need to eat just one fish. They need to eat a bunch of fish, and they need to eat a bunch of snails and insects, and they need to eat a bunch of plants. Biomass gets less and less as you go higher up these pyramids as well. So all these diagrams were just emphasizing these statements. At higher levels, you have less energy, fewer individuals, and less biomass. Okay. Now, let's talk about the last topic in this chapter. Another very important non-living component of ecosystems is matter. And matter cannot be created or destroyed, so we just need to recycle. We need to shuffle around. Certain very important compounds and elements are used and reused in biogeochemical cycles. It's quite a mouthful, pulling in 3 different scientific disciplines: biology, geology, and chemistry. They're not as complicated as they may sound, though. These are just cycles that show the use and reuse of certain compounds and elements. I'm double underlining this because, there are going to be several biogeochemical cycles that we look at. Let's start with one that we've actually already looked at earlier in the quarter. The first one I want to bring up is the carbon cycle. So real quick sales pitch. Why is carbon important? It's the backbone of everything. Every single organic molecule has a backbone of carbon, whether it's a sugar, whether it's a triglyceride, whether it's any of these amino acids. All of our organic compounds are based on carbon, so it's a pretty important element. We need to pay attention to how it's used and reused on the planet. Now, this looks way more complicated than it actually is. Sorry, my figures for this are kind of a little cluttered, seem a little over-labeled. The most important parts of this carbon cycle I've highlighted here. And the important things are that we have fixed carbon, whether it's in marine ecosystems, freshwater ecosystems, or terrestrial ecosystems. We've got fixed carbon, and we've got carbon in the air, or dissolved in the water. And that CO2 is going from the air to a fixed form by photosynthesis. And then it's going from a fixed form back to the air by cellular respiration. That's why I said this was the one I wanted to start with. We talked about this already, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, much earlier in the quarter. And again, this is the cycle. It's just sort of back and forth from CO2 to glucose and other organic compounds, and then back to CO2 again. This happens on land. This happens in the water as well. So let me summarize this. Within the carbon cycle, we have CO2 in the air. When it dissolves in water, we call it bicarbonate. This is fixed into organic compounds like glucose by the process of photosynthesis, and then cellular respiration releases carbon back as CO2 or bicarbonate, and then it does this again. So just back and forth, that's our carbon cycle. Let's do another easy one. Water cycle. Water is not an element, it's a chemical compound, it's, H2O. What's the sales pitch on water? Well, all living things need water. It's the solvent, it dissolves things. Our cells are bags of water. All of our DNA and proteins and organelles need to be dissolved in something, and it's water that they're dissolved in. Yeah, water, pretty important. So where's the cycle? Well, once again, there's a lot of stuff labeled here, but what's important, we're going back and forth from a form in the air to a form that is liquid. So evaporation takes liquid water up to water vapor. Precipitation brings it back down to liquid water again. Again, there's more complicated stuff. It's being used and flowing, but this sort of back and forth from form in the air to form in liquid is really the important part of this cycle. So in summary, during the water cycle, water evaporates from lakes, rivers, oceans, streams, whatever. Importantly, it does take energy to do this conversion from liquid water to water vapor. The energy for water evaporation comes by heat from the sun. And then water vapor present in the air condenses to precipitation, whether it's rain or snow or hail or whatever, and it comes back down eventually to lakes, rivers, oceans, and then we repeat the cycle. So again, we're just using and reusing this same water over and over and over again. All right, let's get into some more abstract ones. Well, okay, not that abstract, but ones that are maybe a little less obvious. Nitrogen cycle. What's the sales pitch on nitrogen? Well, nitrogen is absolutely necessary for nitrogenous bases. Remember these things? These are parts of nucleotides and ATP. So yeah, you can't have DNA or RNA without lots of nitrogen. Oh, I highlighted the nitrogens here. Nitrogen is also necessary for amino acids. I'm only showing 5 of the 20 amino acids, but trust me, all 20 of those protein building blocks have at least one nitrogen as part of their structure. So we don't need as much of this as we need carbon. But we absolutely need nitrogen for proteins and for nucleotides, DNA and RNA. So nitrogen needed for proteins and nucleotides. It is what we call a vital element. So where's our cycle for this? Well, once again, kind of over-labeled. What are the important parts? I've highlighted them here. It's a back and forth. We have nitrogen gas in the air, N2. We've got fixed nitrogen in the soil or in the water. And then we can denitrify and send that nitrogen back to nitrogen gas in the atmosphere. So this is very similar to the carbon cycle in that you've got a back and forth going on. And it's very similar to the carbon cycle in that there are specific chemical pathways that have to happen. It's not just, heat and precipitation like we saw with water. It's a very complicated metabolic pathway to fix gaseous nitrogen into, a fixed form. And it's a complicated pathway to turn this back into nitrogen gas. Importantly, there's a ton of N2 in the air. In fact, if you take in a nice deep breath, most of what you're breathing in is actually nitrogen gas, N2. And that you might think, oh, great, there's nitrogen all around us. That's great because we need nitrogen. Well, we actually can't use this at all. We can't make use of this nitrogen gas that we're breathing in. The only nitrogen we can use is nitrogen that has been fixed into ammonia or other nitrogen-containing compounds. So this step of nitrogen fixation is incredibly important for this pathway. You could not have life on this planet without something that could take this unusable gaseous nitrogen and fix it into something usable. To summarize, nitrogen in the air, N2, is fixed into usable form. I'm writing NH3 ammonia, basically. There are other fixed forms, but this is the simplest one. I'm using the phrase special bacteria. I don't want to name them because there are lots of different species, but yeah, it's bacteria that are capable of doing this fixation. There is a ton of N2 in the air, but often there's not enough of this fixed nitrogen in the soil. So these bacteria are very important. Actually, callback to the previous chapter. These bacteria are so important that plants actively, not all plants, many plants actively try to make homes for these bacteria. They create, there's a pea plant, for example, create these little nodules in their roots that act as a special little safe home for these nitrogen-fixing bacteria to live. The bacteria get a free home, and the plant gives them photosynthesis products. It gives them energy, and in return, the bacteria, which are fixing nitrogen from N2 in the air, are going to give those nitrogen compounds to the plant. So, this is a callback to the previous chapter because this is a type of symbiosis or symbiotic relationship. If you remember those 3 different types, this would be mutualism. Both partners are benefiting from this. Bacteria gets a free home, and the plant gets fixed nitrogen compounds that it can actually use. So anyway, just a side note, but an interesting callback here. Lots of N2 in the air, often limited in the soil. That's why these bacteria are so important. And then of course we have to complete this chain and send it back to the air. There are other decomposing bacteria that can convert fixed nitrogen compounds back to N2, and then we go right back to where we started. So incredibly important cycle because nitrogen's a vital element. Now, we only got a couple more. Next, let's look at the phosphorus cycle. What's the sales pitch for phosphorus? Well, we need phosphorus to make the functional group called a phosphate group. Hopefully that sounds familiar to you. There was a phosphate group that was part of our phospholipids. So we need phosphate in order to make our cell membrane. There is also a phosphate group, or 3 if we're talking about ATP, but there's at least one phosphate group in every single nucleotide, the building blocks of DNA and RNA. So you can't have genetic material without at least a little bit of phosphorus as well. So this is, again, we don't need as much of this as we need carbon, but our cell membrane and our DNA and RNA are pretty important things. We absolutely need phosphorus for those. Needed for nucleotides and lipids. Using that phrase again, vital element. So, what's the cycle here? Oh, this one's actually simpler. So, there is phosphorus that can be put in the air. We're seeing a volcano send phosphorus up into the air. But under normal circumstances, it's not aerosolized. This isn't a back and forth between a gaseous form and a fixed form and sending it back to gas again. Phosphorus is mainly just used and reused. It's dissolved in the soil. It's dissolved in the water. Things are going to take up that phosphorus from the soil and the water. They're going to use it. They're going to poop or die. That's going to go back to being dissolved in the soil and the water, and it's picked up and used again. So this is different from the last couple of ones we've talked about. There's no back and forth. It's not normally existing in the air. It just stays solid. There's no fixation step required. So to summarize, phosphorus can be aerosolized, but there is no common gas form. That means there's no fixation step needed. It's simply used by living organisms and broken down to what's called soluble phosphate or dissolved phosphate in the soil and the water, where it can be picked up and used by living organisms again. So this is probably the simplest of all the cycles, just because there's no fixation or back and forth from gas to solid. All right, last one, the sulfur cycle. What's our sales pitch on sulfur? Well, here are our 20 amino acids. Remember, these are the building blocks of proteins. And you'll notice most of these don't have sulfur. You got carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen. Most of these are just carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen. But if you look closely, and I'll help you look closely, there are 2 of these that do actually have a sulfur atom. Now, 2 out of 20 amino acids seems pretty insignificant, but these are really important amino acids. You might recognize methionine from a few chapters ago. This is what the start codon encodes. This is the first amino acid in every single protein you build. Cysteine is also very important in holding together the tertiary structure of many proteins. So even though you don't need a whole lot of it, you absolutely need, all living things absolutely need some amount of sulfur in order to build proteins. Sulfur needed for, I'm just saying, certain amino acids. You don't need to remember which ones, certain amino acids. It is, once again, a vital element. So, where's our cycle? All right. Well, we're back to having a form in the air and a form in these ecosystems. But what's a little bit different is that we don't need a fixation step to go from atmospheric sulfur to sulfur in terrestrial or marine ecosystems. It precipitates on its own. So we don't need a chemical pathway like photosynthesis or nitrogen fixation. It will precipitate from the air on its own. We do send it back to the air through decomposition, decomposers. That's why, dead, rotting things will smell bad because they're releasing sulfur into the air as they decompose. So it does go back and forth from the air to solid. But yeah, the precipitation that happens naturally means you don't need a pathway of enzymes to fix this. It just precipitates. So sulfur in the air precipitates. There's no fixation needed. It's used by organisms, and then decomposition sends it right back to the air, where if the concentration gets high enough, it'll precipitate and be used again. So you got a pretty simple back and forth here. Now, the last thing I want to say about biogeochemical cycles is that all of these things are important. If you are missing any of these vital compounds and elements, you're not going to be able to live. It's going to be a dead zone in that particular ecosystem. So let's say you're growing a potted plant and you buy some potting soil and there's plenty of sulfur in your potting soil, and there's plenty of phosphorus in your potting soil. There's plenty of nitrogen in your potting soil. There's plenty of carbon just in the air, but you forget to water the dang thing. It's gonna die pretty quickly. Another example, let's say you're growing something and the environment, again, I'm thinking of plants here, but you're growing plants and you got plenty of carbon in the air. You do have plenty of rainfall, plenty of water for these things. You've got plenty of phosphorus in the soil, plenty of sulfur in the soil, but there's not enough nitrogen. That land is not going to be great. It's going to be kind of a dead zone. You're not going to be able to grow things effectively. The life in that ecosystem is going to be very limited if you don't have enough nitrogen, even if you have plenty of all of those other things. And I'll stop my examples there. Any of these five can limit how robust life in the ecosystem is going to be. And here's my summary of that statement. Limits on growth of life in an ecosystem are defined by the compound or element that is most limited. Any of these, the one that is most limited is going to be sort of the cap on how much life can be in that ecosystem. They're all very important. Okay. That brings us to the end of biogeochemical cycles and to the end of this ecosystems chapter. And also this brings us to the end of recorded lecture 5.2. So we've got more ecology stuff coming up, but that's going to be in the next one. This is the end of 5.2.